Nourish now the hunger souls longing in our land. For that day's unfolding, now the time to pause. Only have we eyes to see your epiphany. Powell on 111 on one leg of cheery Malmish Coleri.
So Banu, agus Céad Míle Fáilte. That's blessings and 100,000 welcomes to you all. My name is Joy Powell. I'm the current chairperson of Woman Spirit Ireland, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you from wherever you're joining us in the world for our Brigit in Bulk gathering. The snowdrops are up in my garden. People have already begun to make their brídeogs. So her energy is very near to us. We hope you will be energized to enjoy our celebration of Brigit as Soulsmith, as poet, and as healer. I'm going to hand you over to Kim Milani, who is our webmistress, and then after Kim, Natalie Lough, who is on our board, will introduce you to our guests and speakers. Thank you. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. So before we get into today's great content, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a quick lay of the land in terms of how we're going to use this Zoom webinar function. Unlike the Zoom meeting format, you as participants unfortunately cannot see one another. So we would really like to have you still participate in today's event by using the chat function to share your thoughts and ideas about what you're hearing, to say hello, even just to put a greeting in the chat right now and where you're joining us from. We want to make sure that this is dynamic and something that you feel a part of. One of the things I will note, though, is that we will not be monitoring the chat for questions that you have of our panelists. We're going to be using the Q&A function, which is also at the bottom of your screen, for any questions that you would like to see answered towards the end of today's webinar, when the panelists will return to do a formal Q&A. So please do not hold back your questions. If you have any that emerge throughout the webinar, please type them into that Q&A box, and we will address them at the end of the session when our panelists return. For everyone else, please do also look at the Q&A. Even if you don't want to type in your own question, you have the opportunity to vote for questions that you would like to see answered throughout today's session. So you can upvote questions to the top, and that way we'll know which questions are sort of the most salient to all of you. Lastly, you will see the hand raise function on your toolbar at the bottom, but we will not be using that function throughout this webinar. So again, communicate through the chat with each other and communicate with us with your questions through the Q&A. Now over to you, Natalie.
Hi, thank you, Kim. We are delighted tonight to bring you a veritable feast of a panel to celebrate Imbolc. We have experts from the area of Brigit and a wonderful selection of musicians and artists. First up tonight, I hope we can give a warm welcome to Jenny Beale. Jenny is the director of Brigit's Garden, and she credits this creation as being inspired by previous Woman Spirit Ireland's events many moons ago. And she's now going to lead us through a virtual visit and a commentary of Brigit's Garden and its ethos. Over to you, Jenny.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me all right. It's a warm hello from Galway, in fact, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you all for this very special celebration. So Brigit was a weaver, and her tradition is like a shining thread that weaves through the centuries from her ancient aspect of goddess of the land, through her reinvention as the Christian saint, and on to us today. A shining thread that carries stories and symbols and inspiration, that holds the divine feminine in her many forms and reminds us of our deep connection to the land. So I think Brigit still speaks to us today with strength and clarity as we struggle to mend our connection with the earth, to remember that we too are part of nature and the cycle of life, and to rediscover the joy of relationship with the natural world. So I'm sure you know that one of the best known Brigit stories tells how St. Brigit acquired the land for her monastery at Kildare through her enchanted cloak. There are many versions of this story, and I'd like to share a version with you tonight and follow that with a very short video that locates the Brigit Festival of Brigit's Day within the cycle of the seasons. So this is the story. Many years ago, a young woman called Brigit had a vision. She saw a grove of beautiful old oak trees, and nestled close to them, a simple wooden church. Nearby, there were dwellings and vegetable gardens, beehives, ducks and swans on a small lake, and a herd of cattle grazing a meadow. As this colourful and peaceful scene formed before her eyes, Brigit heard a voice saying that this was her destiny, and that she should go to the King of Leinster to ask for some land on which she could build the church and create the community that she had seen. The vision stayed with Brigit, and she often felt confused or puzzled by it. But the call was strong, and she felt compelled to do what had been asked of her. So one spring day, she got up, packed some bread and a jar of milk into a bag, wrapped her long cloak around her, and set off on foot to see the king. She walked all day, asking directions from people she met along the way, until she finally arrived at the king's rath or fort. Brigit knocked 3 times on the gate, and a servant answered. He saw a dusty young woman with mud on her shoes and was inclined to shut the gate again. But when she spoke, he felt strangely compelled to let her in. After waiting some time, she was ushered in to see the king, who was sitting outside under an apple tree. He was used to dealing with petitions and giving judgment in petty quarrels, and had a reputation for directness and quick decision-making. Its eyes sparkled with energy as she explained her mission and asked for land on which she could build her church. But the king was dismissive of this unknown young woman and her overblown ambitions. What was in it for him? Did she not know how valuable land was these days? It was an unreasonable request based on some silly dream, and he tried to end the audience. Brigit, however, could still hear the compelling voice of the vision in her mind and was not going to give up. She persisted and kept on asking and explaining how important it was, until she finally pleaded with the king to please let her have just as much land as her cloak would cover. The king looked at the very ordinary, rather worn cloak this tiresome young woman was wearing, and so to get rid of her, he agreed. So Brigit took off her cloak and laid it out very gently on the grass under the apple tree. And the moment the cloth touched the land, a strange white mist rose up all around them. And out of the mist appeared 4 fairy-like women, who bent down and picked up the edges of the cloak and started to run north, south, east and west. And as they ran, the cloak grew and rippled out wider and wider over the land, like a river bursting its banks. Eventually, the king shouted, "Stop!" the women and the mist vanished, and the cloak lay still, covering the entire Curragh of Kildare. And that is the story of how Brigit started her monastery, building her church and her community just as the vision had showed her, in the shelter of the old oak trees. That grew in size and influence under Brigit's leadership, a community of women and men and animals, of healing, of relationship, a community built on sacred land that honoured nature and the seasons. And I think Brigit really calls to us today through this story, and she calls us to spread our own cloaks wherever we can, to create sacred land, whether it is on our gardens or our backyards, our community parks or our local woodlands, to spread the cloak of community for people and nature. So I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to spread my little cloak over 11 acres of rich land in County Galway, which is now Brigit's garden, with the intention of creating a place where both people and nature could flourish, and where the Brigit tradition could bring an extra dimension of meaning, calling us to notice and connect with the cycle of the seasons. So the gardens are based on the 4 Celtic festivals, of which Brigit's Day is one. So I have put together a very short 3-minute video with some images from Brigit's garden, following the cycle of the old Celtic festivals over the year, to remind us how Brigit's Day and the start of spring connect with this beautiful wheel of the year. So if we can just start the video now, that'd be great.
The Celtic cycle begins at Samhain, Halloween, when the old year dies and the new one begins slowly in the winter, the season of the Cailleach, the old woman, time to connect with the earth, for reflection, for dreaming, and for diving into the dark. In the cold of January, the light begins to grow again, and the first sign of spring is the snowdrop. And then Brigit is here, bringing the spring, inviting us to awaken, renew ourselves, and start to bring our dreams to life. The land begins to green. It brings the spring flowers in the gardens and woodlands, birdsong and blossom. And soon it is Bealtaine, May Day, the start of summer, with the gorgeous sounds of the dawn chorus. This is an expansive time of rapid growth everywhere, with meadows wonderfully in bloom, feeding the bees and the butterflies, and inviting us to grow and blossom too in the summer warmth. Soon, August brings Lunasa and the move to the harvest season. The apples are ripening, the colours are mellowing. It is a time of abundance, thanksgiving, and gathering in. In the life cycle, this is the time of the elders, of wisdom, of celebration. And soon the shadows are beginning to lengthen, the leaves are turning, and nature is winding down for the winter rest. The circle has brought us back to the great festival of Samhain, Halloween, marking the death of the old year, the time to remember the ancestors, to shed what we need to let go of, and to welcome the growing dark as the wheel turns and the cycle begins again.
Well, I hope that just gave you a brief sense of, I think one of the beauties of all of this is starting to see that time has a circular aspect. It doesn't always have to be in a straight line. And that the Brigit celebration is part of that great cycle of the year, which is also the cycle of life. And I'll just add that we are offering another Brigit celebration by Zoom tomorrow evening from Brigit's Garden, and you're all warmly invited to join us, and I'll put the link in the chat box later. But I'd just like to finish by saying, I think all these stories and everything we're going to hear tonight, let's heed the call of Brigit to connect with the land wherever we are, and to tune into the cycle of the seasons, and to spread our cloaks with gratitude, with humility, and with intention. And may they be cloaks of protection. And may we commit ourselves fiercely with the passion and vision of Brigit to the stewardship and healing of the earth. For our cloaks too can be magical, and who knows how far they may spread. So thank you, and blessings to all of you.
Well, that was just such a treat. And that was from Pádraig na Húlachan's Brigit Bua, which I believe you'll have the translation of in your resource packet. And wonderful video as well from Jenny Beale on her tour of Brigit's Garden in Galway. Our next speaker tonight is Dr. Rosarie Kingston. Rosarie is a practitioner in herbal medicine in West Cork in Ireland. She lectures in the Department of Folklore and Ethnology at UCC, or University College Cork. Her PhD examined Irish vernacular medicine in the 21st century. And Rosarie considers this blending of science and tradition paramount to the progression of modern healthcare. So we're going to hear from Rosarie now. And over to you, Rosarie.
Mute. Let's start my audio. Hello, everyone, and I am very, very honored to be here this evening. I am a very poor follow on from that wonderful, absolutely inspiring talk and video by Jenny. I will share my screen now and we can get started, because I'm going to talk on dandelion. And dandelion is generally considered to be Brigit's flower. And even though most of us consider it a very troublesome weed, and we spend a lot of time trying to get rid of it in the garden, we are misguided, because it is actually not a weed, but an incredibly valuable herb. First and foremost, it is one of the first plants to appear in the spring, especially here in Southwest Ireland. And the flowers bloom from February onwards, so they're a very valuable source of nectar for the bees. Dandelions are also used as food by the caterpillars and the larvae of some species of butterflies and moths. They're also used as a nectar source by some of the emerging butterflies in the spring. But first of all, let me introduce myself. As Kim already said, I practice as a medical herbalist in an integrative care practice, which is actually very important because I work alongside a GP, I work alongside chiropractors, counseling, all of that. And it makes me realize what an important part such a different type of medicine has to offer to people, where depending on the problem or the condition, the right person is actually seen. And it is wonderful to be able to talk to patients and to realize the traditions they actually still practice and how important they are actually to their own health care. I think one of the saddest things from my practice is how so many of these traditions are being lost. I can remember talking to a woman and recommending a particular herb for her, and she told me that she remembered using it as a child. And I said, why did you stop using it? And the reply I got was so sad. She said, well, when we could afford to go to the doctor, the neighbors knew we had come up in the world. So herbal medicine, the old vernacular cures, are actually associated with poverty. I published a book in 2021 called Ireland's Hidden Medicine, and it is about the history of our vernacular medicine and how it is at its very roots different to biomedicine, or Western medicine as we call it. It is about the fact that Irish vernacular medicine, the cures, the pishogues, come from a different worldview. And they come from the worldview of an indigenous society, be you the Native Americans or belonging to Aboriginals of Australia. The worldview is totally different to that of the Cartesian worldview that informs us today. I teach on that subject at University College Cork, and I also continue my research there. But let us turn to the dandelion. Now, it belongs to the Asteraceae family, and in Irish it is called Cashabon. It derives its English name from the French Dante de Leon, and this refers to the deeply lobed leaf, which you can see here on the right, even though some varieties have it slightly less sharp than the picture I have there. You'll know what kind of a day you have because the flowers will not open, the petals will not open if the day is cloudy. And of course, they will always close in at night. And then, of course, we have the famous dandelion clock. And all of us remember blowing on those as children, and children still do it. The wind, or children, are the reason that the dandelion spreads everywhere, because as you can see down at the bottom here, you can see the little seed is attached to these little parachutes. And when they're blown, they go all over the place. One of the reasons it is linked to St. Brigit's, by the way, is because of Brigit's association with fertility and new birth of all new life in spring. So we're familiar with all the young calves, the young lambs, we're familiar with all of that, all the young in the fields in the spring. But what we're not aware of is that dandelions are a very useful source of food for the ewes, or the cow for that matter. This is because the leaves of the dandelion are very beneficial for the gut. And they also contain a good amount of inulin, which promotes bacterial flora in the intestinal tract, the good sort. Dandelions also have an effect on prolactin, and increased prolactin will lead to more milk. So dandelion leaves increase the milk supply in the lactating ewe. So we tend to forget this richness that we actually have on our doorstep. Now, we're all familiar with warts, verrucas, whatever way you like to call it. And the dandelion leaf has been used forever and ever for curing this. It has a milky white sap, and this is known as dandelion milk. It's actually a latex. And the root actually contains more, but traditionally, the part that was used was the sap oozing from the top of the stem where it joins the flower. Some accounts say that this juice has to be applied for 9 days, and that probably does make sense because warts are fairly difficult to eradicate. But the basis of the treatment and why it is actually quite a success is because the sap is highly alkaline and has germicidal, insecticidal, and fungicidal properties. And of course, warts are a fungus. Now, interestingly enough, current research is actually examining dandelion flower for treatment for skin disorders, especially those that are caused by bacteria or by fungal infections. And the research looks fairly promising. So we might actually be growing dandelions to harvest them as distinct from wildcrafting them, which is what we do at the moment. Now, it is also highly nutritious. It is incredibly nutritious, either raw or cooked. It contains vitamins A, C, E, and K, folate, and a small amount of B vitamins. It also contains minerals. These are iron, calcium, magnesium, potassium. So the leaves then are well worth adding to a salad or a stir fry. Now, one of the problems is that they are incredibly bitter. But they're not as bitter if you can actually get them before the flowers come out, before the flowers appear. But they're more difficult to identify before the flowers appear. The other way you can mask the incredible bitterness of the dandelion leaf is to add 1 part dandelion to 5 parts other greens. So you could have purslane, you could have beetroot leaves, you could have lettuce, anything like that. But the bitterness is also useful because the bitterness will increase the digestive juices, and it will actually be very, very good as a cholagogue. Now, the other thing about dandelion leaves is that, which we probably all know, it increases diuresis. In other words, you will urinate more if you actually drink a lot of dandelion or eat a lot of dandelions. But there is a lovely thing about dandelions. Generally speaking, if you are prescribed a diuretic by your physician, you will more than likely also be prescribed potassium, because conventional diuretics will leach potassium from the body, and you can't afford to have that happen to you. But if you take dandelion leaf as your diuretic, this doesn't happen, because there is so much potassium in dandelion, it actually balances out. So you don't lose potassium if you actually use dandelion as your diuretic. Now, if we actually look at stimulating the appetite, it contains the carbohydrate inulin, and this, as I mentioned earlier, improves the gastrointestinal flora in the gut. And we're all being told how important it is to have these probiotics at the moment. Actually, you could save yourself a few bob, because you could just go out and pick some dandelion leaves and more or less do the same job for you. It is incredibly rich in fiber. So it also gets rid of dyspepsia, which is burping. It gets rid of diverticulosis, and so many people suffer from this today. It also improves irritable bowel. Now, I would actually recommend dandelions or pre-meal bitters. I would always say that a tiny bowl of bitter, very bitter leaves, about half an hour before a meal, is actually very, very good for people who have any kind of an allergy or who suffer from gas or bloating. And more significantly, they suffer from sugar cravings, because sugar cravings are the beginning, if you like, of diabetes, that you can't control the sugar level coming in. The other thing dandelion is good for is if children have constipation, because it's quite soothing, but it will get rid of the constipation. Now, we kind of think this is all new research, but that's actually not true, because in the National Folklore Schools collection, it was recorded in Quailmore in County Mayo that pounding the dandelion and drinking the juice was a cure for a bad appetite and for people who were weak and not eating. They've also been used in Ireland traditionally, and most of the cures for dandelion in the British Isles actually come from Ireland, especially the ones for the liver and that. And they've been used to treat liver and gallbladder, and of course it would, because of the bitter nature of dandelion makes it a cholagogue, which means it improves the function and the tone of the liver and gallbladder. It was also used, to treat liver and rheumatism. And the cure was recorded here as well in County Leitrim, that if a person has rheumatism and if they eat dandelion, he will be cured. It also, the same thing comes from Broadford in County Limerick. The root of it is sometimes boiled and given to a person who has rheumatism. Now, it is interesting, they mention the root, whereas the first lot seem to give the impression that it is dandelion leaf. Now, the entry in the National Folklore Collection from County Limerick also mentions that it is very good for giving it for a cough or a cold. And interesting enough, that use is very dominant in China and would also have come from Persia. So we can more or less, that may indicate that it came to, that particular use came to us through the medical manuscripts, through the Galenic area, rather than from an indigenous tradition. Now, it is also used for curing thrush, which again is a fungal infection, and it was also given as a food to turkeys and to pigs. So you can see dandelions should not be really weeded out of the lawn that quickly. Now, so it is used for many things. We can actually see, we also know that it normalizes blood sugar levels, and that will go back to the inulin, and it will go back to that it stops the sugar cravings. It is also if you lower cholesterol, and the total cholesterol, that is, and the triglycerides, and it will actually raise the good cholesterol. So look a bit more favorably at that lot of dandelions that you have growing in your garden. Now, because it's doing that for cholesterol, it would also support the traditional use it has for treating the liver. Now, what can you do with the root? Now, the root can be stewed. The root can be added to a casserole, so it can be cooked as a vegetable. By the way, the taproot of dandelion can extend to 5 meters. So you're not going to get up a big dandelion, but generally the ones that are harvested for food are much thicker. They have been bred to be a much bigger root than what we would have here. The root can also be decocted as a tea, and to decoct a herb, you actually have to boil it for 20 minutes, strain it and let it cool. So there is a difference between an infusion. An infusion is where you pour water off the boil on top of the herb, and you'd let it infuse like you would ordinary tea. So an infusion is much the same as ordinary tea, whereas a decoction, which you would use for woody parts or for roots, you actually have to boil for 20 minutes and then strain and let cool. Now you can also roast the dandelion root, and roasted, after being roasted, can be ground and can be used as a substitute for coffee. So all in all, you can use it in many different ways, and it's a very, very healthy addition to the diet. Be careful though where you pick it, because so often it has actually been sprayed. Let's put it like that. So there are also records of it being used in Ireland for consumption. We've already seen how it can be used for coughs and colds. And one account from, again, County Limerick tells us that dandelion is a cure for TB or consumption when the disease is at its early stages. And it can be eaten raw. And again, this particular record tells us that it can be used as a general tonic and a cure for liver and kidney trouble. So all in all, we can see that it was valued and used. Now, it also grows in meadows, serves as food for pigs, but generally when given to pigs, it was added to chopped thistles. The juice of the dandelion is good for warts, and it is also given to birds. And again, as I mentioned before, it's given for stomach diseases or stomach sufferers. So the herb associated with Brigit is definitely reflective of her healing prowess. And I think we need to actually realize that the stories of healing that we get in vernacular medicine reflects Brigit's connection with the land and with the generosity that the land has given us and which we so often ignored. Thank you. I have given a bibliography, by the way, here, which you can also look up if you want to.
Well, that was fantastic and so informative. I'm definitely going to put the humble dandelion, which is hiding in plain sight, into my food repertoire and try some pre-meal bitters after that. So I'm very much looking forward to getting your book as well to learn a lot more. Very, very insightful. Our next speaker tonight is no stranger to Woman Spirit Ireland and has been a key contributor over the years. Ruth Marshall is a storyteller, author, poet, and an arts and heritage facilitator. She shares seasonal festival traditions with school children through the County Clare Museum Education Programme. She also works with the Heritage in Schools programme and also with adults in her own creative workshops. With nature, seasonal change, and the value of handmade as recurring themes, Ruth views poetry and story as medicine for Earth and for ourselves. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Ruth, who will read some beautiful poetry on Brigit.
My first encounters with Women's Spirit Ireland would have been back in the 1990s, when I used to travel way up to Belfast to take part in their Brigit celebrations. I remember on one occasion spending the first evening holding one end of a length of straw, another woman at the other end, and using this traditional tool called a thrawcrook to twist that straw to make a shugan rope that would be used in the closing ritual. And this is the poem that came from that experience. Making the Crus. Brigit's Eve, Belfast, 2001. Golden straw bound us, an umbilicus we twisted together, you turning one way and I another, but always sunwise. All those women's lives, the stories shared as they wove their rushes, became rich yarns we wound into that yellow rope. They bound spells into their babies' first clothes with the fine continuous spiral of the wool. All mothers knew their love was a shield, a fierce and warm protection to those fresh from the womb. They say that weavers made magic, fashioned silks to clothe the earth like Brigit's cloak, running out and beyond the edge of the known, covering the land with bright stars. Spinsters were women still themselves. The fabric of life was made by more than human hands. Loving came through clear channels, direct from the heart. 3 lengths we spun and plaited, till we made a circular gateway to a new life. Feasted on milk and honey, we stepped through, willingly, warriors, healers, poets all. We stepped through, remembering. May Brigit's girdle give you healing. May Brigit's fire give you inspiration. May Brigit's creativity give you a way. And this next poem is celebrating Brigit. Yesterday, the women made crosses and bound bundled rushes for breed oaks, dressing them lovingly in rags torn from an old white sheet. Today, I woke early, dreaming of my mother, the road below silent as Christmas. Snow has made brides of the hedges, thrown a mantle over the first tender greens, rounded the corners of the real world, making Volkswagen Beetles of the cars. Yesterday, the women made magic, humming like bees making honey to nourish the soul of the world. They broke bread together and stepped through the fire that did not burn. Today, I gather fuel in case this weather holds, tend my own hearth, fetch water, write and pray. And somehow Brigit is always connected to my own mother. This last poem for this evening's is Inheritance. Birds brought the seed of the rowan tree you planted on the strip of grass between our council house and the one next door. Dropped it in the gravel under the porch of my new home, where it took root and grew to reach the clear corrugated roof. Brought me the ring you wore, the thin skin, the brown eyes that shock me whenever I see you looking out of my reflection in shop windows. And snowdrops with small white reassurances that I can live my life differently. Thank you.
Just beautiful there from Ruth Marshall. Yeah, just beautiful. I'm really feeling spring. Our next speaker tonight is Mary Condren. For many of you, Mary needs no introductions. And for those of you who do not know her visionary work and energy, which spans over 30 years, Mary is co-founder and director of Woman Spirit Ireland. She teaches on the topic of gender and the culture of violence at the Centre for Gender and Women's Studies at Trinity College, Dublin. She is currently researching Brigit in the Living Traditions, the Lives of Saint Brigit, and Brigit in the Saga literature. And we are really hoping we get a book from Mary soon, because it's going to be very exciting stuff. Tonight, Mary will speak on Brigit as healer, political, social, and personal. Over to you, Mary.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you for your generous introduction there, Natalie. I'm having a little bit of difficulty enlarging my screen. I'm still seeing Natalie's on the screen. Can I get some help there? Because I want to share my video.
Mary, you're seeing
Okay.
you're seeing a different view than our participants. So you just carry on and you're looking great on the screen.
Okay, I've got it now. It's whatever was happening. I'm sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. And as Natalie has just said, my topic this evening is Brigit Soulsmith, poet and healer. I'm still having a bit of trouble. My screen is, okay, I've thrown it up to one side. Okay. One of the nicest stories I know about Brigit is that when she was a young girl, people all around her, and this was in Connemara, saw fire coming from her house. But when they went to the house, they saw no flames and nothing had been burnt, because the fire that came out of Brigit was not the fire that destroys. It was the fire that does not burn. And I like that image of Brigit, the fire that does not burn. And for me, what it symbolizes is another story about Brigit, which is when she went back to her father, because you see, she was born of a slave woman and a free man. And the wife of the free man couldn't bear to have a pregnant slave woman around, so they kicked her out, and she was sold off to druids and poets. But finally, she ended back with her father. But she had an addiction, an awful addiction, and that addiction was to generosity. She couldn't help sharing every single thing that she had and giving things away. So the father decided he had enough. So having got a little bit of freedom back to her biological family, he decided he was going to sell her back into slavery. And so he approached the local king and left her in the chariot, went into the king, and the king and her father made a deal. And out they came to collect Brigit. But when they got there, they saw that Brigit had given away the father's sword to a passing leper because the leper was hungry. And so the father was ready to kill her. And this is actually in the Lives of the Saints. The father was ready to kill her. And the men had thought this was a done deal. But the king turned to the father and said, this woman is going to be a very difficult woman for you to sell and an even harder one for me to buy, because Brigit can neither be bought nor sold. In other words, the fire within her was so strong, what we call the nyart, or the life force, or the divine vibrations, was so extraordinarily potent within her that nothing could, she couldn't be got at, basically, which is the kind of thing that we also now learn to do, to be. Now, people are often asked, why Brigit? Why did you go back to Brigit? Or why do you even bother? And the answer to that for me is that for many years, as you know, in Ireland, we went through 35 years of absolute horror, with bombings and murders and hunger strikes and horrific stuff. And at the center of it all were, issues between loyalists and Republicans, and they were supported alternatively by Protestants and Catholics. Although you might say it wasn't a religious fight, nevertheless, religious forms legitimated or gave strength to it. And so from the very beginning, when I came back to Ireland in 1986, my question was, how can we begin to make a difference? What can we do for the symbolic violence that these religions seem to represent? And I always remember the baptismal formula of the early Christians. In other words, when babies or adults were about to be baptized, the formula literally said, in Christ, there is neither male nor female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, but all are one in Christ Jesus. Now, a similar story is, or similar sentiments are represented by all the different religious traditions, but nevertheless, in religious history and Western history, things have not quite worked out that way. So Brigit would be saying that a person without a soul friend is like a body without a head, and choose one who will burn you the most. In other words, when you're seeking to find a way of making a difference, one has to have mirrors, soul friends, people who will support you in order to do that. And I've been very fortunate in that I have got those soul friends and colleagues and fellow travelers through Women's Spirit Ireland. And I'm deeply grateful that we've all been able to accompany one another on that journey. So the personal healing is the fire within that we must cultivate through whatever practices we find to do that. Soul friends will be one of them, meditation might be another. There might be many different ways in which we cultivate that fire. But unless we do cultivate that fire, the difference that we might be able to make by honoring Brigit will be quickly dissipated. Now, I was very interested, before I move on, by Rosalie's comment about the dandelion and by the local people saying, well, we stopped using dandelions when we could show that we had gone up in the world. And it's really funny because when I'm researching Brigit, which I have been doing now for many, many years, the writers of the living traditions and others say, well, she belonged to the common people. Or some of them will even say, well, they're the lower orders, this belonged to the lower orders. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, because for many, many years, women have been the lower orders, in the sense that we have been excluded from the holy places. Homosexuals are always excluded. Othering becomes a dominant theme. History is riddled with warfare, often under religious auspices. So if we're going to be making a difference, we have to begin to critically confront what we call the religions of empire, those religions who have legitimated colonial expeditions all over the world and have legitimated warfare. We need to go back to the religions of the lower orders, or what we might call the religions of the hearth. That's H-E-A-R-T. And for instance, in our Brigit festivals, we never have an altar. What we always have is a hearth, the hearth space in the middle, because the hearth space was where the ancestors lived, traditionally in the houses, and places to the people to whom we are accountable, both from our previous ancestors and to the future generations, because obviously what we're doing now to the earth has radical, horrific implications for the future generations. Now, the other issue about religions of empire is that they are mostly legitimated through sacrifice, whether it's the sacrifice of Jesus because of the desire of God the Father, or Abraham's attempt to sacrifice his son Isaac, which was interrupted, or the death of Hussein in the Islamic tradition. But what we don't often realize is that in most religions traditions, they say quite uncategorically in the prophets, including Jesus, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Get away with your burnt offerings. We've had enough of them. And it's that issue, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, that I want to relate to the question of Brigit's cloak. Because there is a beautiful image of Brigit's cloak that has all shades, colors, forms, and that the beautiful story that Jenny told us about the cloak traveling through the efforts of the 4 women all over the land to gain as much space as Brigit needed for her work. So what does the cloak mean? Jenny has told us a beautiful story, but in my research, the issue of the cloak goes way, way back, way beyond Brigit. And here we have the cloak of mercy, an image of Brigit in the image of the Virgin Mary, whose cloak encompasses all manners of ethnicity, sexual expression, race, size, gender. And in every image of the Virgin Mary that you will find from the early Christian churches, it is the image of the cloak. The cloak is the image of the Virgin Mary holding, she's containing violence, not spurring it on. And mercy is one of the traditions that will contain violence and not spur it on. And mercy and the cloak is not specific to the Irish traditions. It goes, or even the Celtic traditions, it goes all the way around the world. This image here is the image of Sarasvati it's Kuan Yin. It's Kuan Yin in the Chinese tradition. And the story about Kuan Yin is at the quarterly festivals, she goes out and she collects the dew of mercy and she pours it upon her petitioners. And the similar stories are told all over Eastern, Southern, Western Europe, which we can eventually be able to tell you more about. So the role of the abbesses of Kildare was that of turning back the streams of war. I found that in a tiny little footnote in an article, which had been largely lost until, sometimes when you see these things, shivers go down your spine and you realize you're in touch with what I call cellular memory. And of course, we know that the abbesses of Kildare, the last 2 of them, were raped and pillaged. And finally, in the synods of the 11th and 12th century, all their authority was stripped from them. And that was a time when, women effectively lost around the world, certainly in the Christian tradition, any offices that gave them authority. From that point on, authority rested entirely in a male separatist clergy. So turning back the streams of war, this is again back to Brigit. She shakes her cloak, she puts clouds between opposing enemies so they cannot see one another. Those stories are all through her lives. She hypnotizes each side, she gives them the dreams. They wake up thinking that they have won, but actually not a drop of blood had been shed. And again, this is a story straight out of the lives of Saint Brigit. But the other main characteristic of Brigit, which is quite extraordinary, there's an old Irish life of Brigit called the Beth of Brigit. And there are 33 chapters or paragraphs in it. And 23 of the 33 incidents concern generosity. Now, one of the stories is about the rich woman and her apples. A rich woman came to Brigit and gave her a huge bag of apples, or a huge basket of apples. And Brigit said, "Thank you very much." And she started then to distribute them to all the people. And the rich woman came along and said, "For God's sake, I didn't tell you to do that. You know, I gave them to you." And Brigit, what did she do? She said, "Your orchards will never have fruit again, because riches that are not shared will wither on the vine." Similarly, 2 lepers came to her to be healed, and she healed the first leper. And then she turned to the second, she turned to the one that she had healed, and she asked him to heal his brother, because now he should be able to heal his brother. And the second one said, "I'm not going to go near that dirty leper. What would I be doing, you know, going near him?" So what did Brigit do? She could be quite a bit of a wagon at times. She healed the second brother, and then she reinfected the first one. Again, because unless the beneficiaries of her grace and beneficence would not pass it on, then they would somehow suffer the consequences. I often talk about the maternal or the parental table. And this again relates to generosity and why it's so important now to focus our thinking on the lower orders. Because if we look at the ethics of the house, you know, a family would not sit down, parents, 6 children, and say, well, those 2 children over here can have most of the food and the other 4 can have what is left. It would be absolutely unthinkable that we would do that. But that is exactly what we do in the public world. In the public world, we can say, those of us in the West who have benefited from colonialism, benefited from all the wars, benefited from exploiting the rest of the world for thousands of years, can enjoy the fruits of the earth, while those who are in the 2/3 world can just put up with it and not change. We don't need to change. So exactly the opposite has happened increasingly in the hands of a few. In other words, the table, the parental table, the maternal table, where the family will share everything equally, is in the public world is exactly the opposite. And that's why, again, we need to reconcile the ethics of the lower orders. And I use that term with a smile and whatever. But also as a term of distinction, actually, at this point. We are all of the lower orders, but the ethics of the lower orders, where we would never dream of leaving 2/3 of the people hungry, has to be extended into the public world. Now, the Chris Breda is another aspect of healing in Brigit's. The Chris Brede is a rope, and Ruth in her beautiful poetry talked about making the Sugan rope and making it into a belt. And in our ceremonies, we, at the end of our Brigit festivals, we hold the Chris. 2 people hold the Chris, and a woman goes through it and goes left and gets rid of negativity and gets rid of disappointment. And then they go in again and they go right. And they give gratitude and thanks for everything that they've got in the previous year. And then finally, they go through it completely this time. And they make commitments as to how they are going to effect and adopt and live in the spirit of Brigit and healing and of generosity. But again, the kris, like the cloak, is an international symbol. I could show you many, many images of the krisana as they are used throughout the world, but I just have time to show you one. And here's one of the Virgin Mary with her little girdle around her waist. But there are many other images where the girdle is used for healing, to help women give birth, to help women in pregnancy, or even in the lives of many saints. We can see the girdle being used to abort a dead fetus. So these are by no means, you know, the material, what I call the material artifacts of Brigit, which are the cloak and the kris and then the cross, are by no means, as it were, peasant, you know, innocuous symbols. They are very deeply rooted in the symbolic history of a female divinity, which again is something that we need to recuperate. And, you know, we have lost a great deal of our history, but this is an extraordinary image. It's a detail of the Moylach Belt Shrine, which is held in the National Museum in Ireland. And you look at that and you think, oh gosh, isn't it beautiful? Gold and silver and bronze. But the important thing is not the gold and the silver and bronze. It's a tiny little leather belt, which is inside the shrine. The shrine holds this tiny little leather belt because it was held with such great reverence by communities and generations of people, probably in the west of Ireland. And it was found and recognized as to what it was, and held in the Moylach Belt Shrine ever since. And again, you know, as I said, in the lives of the saints, both male and female saints used these krisana in order to heal. Finally, we have the image of the cross. I should probably do this in reverse. Okay, there's a little, no, I won't. You see the eyes, and the eyes are from a Syrian image of eyes. And again, throughout the world, there are images of what we call the eye goddess. And the eye goddess is the divinity who is keeping watch over the community and making sure and hoping and exhorting them to hold on to the deepest values that come from the heart, and again, of their indigenous communities. Now, those images, and I could show you many, many more of them, are also represented by Brigit's cross, because Brigit's cross is also a symbol of the eye goddess. It has many different possibilities, but in Brigit's ceremonies, very often we put a seed or a potato even into the middle of the Brigit's cross in order to put it out into the ground in order to support fertility. So the genealogy of Brigit is also a prayer for protection. Now, I seem to be covering my own copy of that. I'll see if I can move. Oh yeah, that's good. I can move it over. The genealogy of Brigit, every day and every night that I say the genealogy of Brigit, I shall not be killed. I shall not be injured. I shall not be enchanted. I shall not be cursed. Neither shall my power leave me. No earth, no sod, no turf shall cover me. No fire, no sun, nor moon shall burn me. No water, no lake, no sea shall drown me. No air, no wind, no vapor shall sicken me. No glamour out of fairy shall o'ertake me. And I, under the protection of the Holy Maiden, my gentle foster mother, my beloved Brigit. So tonight, or tomorrow, I should say, on Brigit's Eve, our tradition here in Ireland is that we put out a piece of precious cloth, or it can be an ordinary piece of cloth, and we put it out onto the open fields, again, in order to absorb the dew of mercy, because it is the dew of mercy that will be the nurturing fluid rather than the blood of sacrifice. It will be the dew of mercy that will that will create and that will honor and inspire our ongoing work in relation to the call that Jenny made for the nurturing of the earth. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that was very thought-provoking. And I think there were so many messages still relevant for the world today that can be found so many centuries ago in the work of Brigit, the lives of Brigit, etc. Thanks very much, Mary, for that. Our next contributor tonight is the talented Evelie Delfino Sales Posh. I hope I pronounced that correctly. You could say that Evelie has many hats. She is an enchantress, a sacred song singer writer, a musician, a Babalan indigenous shamanic practitioner, a reclaiming priestess and teacher in the musical and a teacher in musical theatre as a prayer former, and she's also an activist. She brings compassion, joy, and energy to her healing ceremonies and teaching. And she's going to sing us a beautiful song this evening to the traditional Irish tune, Mogelamer, with the healing words who are composed by the peace activist Starhawk. Weaver, 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 our thread. So over to you, Evelie.
From joy and pain our lives are spun, but all too soon the spinning's done. Weaver, weaver, weave her thread, whole and strong into your web. Healer, healer, heal her pain, in love may she return again. No one knows why we are born. A web is made, a web is torn. Like wandering seabirds we alight, to rest one moment, then take flight. Weaver, weaver, weave her thread, whole and strong into your web. Healer, healer, heal her pain, in love may she return again. So may we find the hidden way beyond the gates of night and day, to that sweet land where apples grow and endless healing waters flow. Weaver, weaver, weave her thread, whole and strong into your web. Healer, healer, heal her pain, in love may she return again. And at that spring may we drink deep, and wake to dream, and die to sleep, and dreaming weave another form, a shining thread of life reborn. Weaver, weaver, weave her thread, whole and strong into your web. Healer, healer, heal her pain. In love may she return again. In love may she return again. In love may she return again.
My goodness, that was just so special. I don't know about ye, but I had shivers. So beautiful. Our next speaker tonight is Séamas Ó Catháin, and we are delighted to have Séamas with us tonight. He is the author of Festivals of Brigit, and we have it on good authority that a new book is in the process where he's going to revise and reprint the Festivals of Brigit, so we're very excited about that. Tonight he's going to speak to us on the topic of hearth prayers in the Brigit traditions. Just a bit about Séamas. Séamas is the former head of the School of Irish Celtic Studies and Irish Folklore and Linguistics at University College Dublin, or UCD. He has published numerous academic articles and books on aspects of Irish and international folklore. And his book, The Festival of Brigit, Celtic Goddess and Holy Woman, was awarded the Ruth Michelle Yana Ratcliffe Prize, the Dag Strombach Prize, and the Göran Sahlgren Prize by the Royal Gustavus Adolphus Academy for Swedish Folk Culture. Phew, I hope I pronounced that all correctly. Séamas, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Séamas.
Thank you. I'm doing something wrong here. Yeah. Hello. I've lost it somewhere in the ether.
If you could turn your camera on, Séamas, that would be great.
Unmute. Okay, am I in business?
You're
Nope.
great. Perfect. We can see you.
What?
We can see you perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, I don't need to see myself, of course. Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you, Woman Spirit Ireland, for the invitation to participate in this prestigious event this evening. I'd like to begin, if I may, by dedicating my remarks to some members of my extended family, all deceased, unfortunately, all called Brigit in one form or another. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, my aunt, my great-aunt, and my first cousins, Brige and Brigit. I think in the current extended family, there are no Brigits. I don't think that's unusual nowadays. I hope it changes in the future. Now, I want to begin next with a slide, I think. I don't know whether it's being seen or not. Yeah, the next, please. Yes, I just want to say a few things about this book, A Handbook of Irish Folklore by Sean O'Sullivan, published in 1942 and republished in 1970, as you see, in Detroit. And also, I'd like to say, now available in Kindle, and I'm also pleased to say that I was asked to write a new introduction to it, and if anybody's interested, they can access it online. Next. The dedication in that book, sorry, not that one, no, the previous one, please. The dedication in that book reads, "To the Swedish people whose scholars evolved the system for folklore classification outlined in these pages, and to the generation of Irish people, both living and dead, who preserved on their lips for us our rich source of traditional lore, this book is gratefully dedicated." That may surprise some people, and you may well wonder, what has Sweden got to do with Ireland? And I hope I'll be able to show through the little I have to say about hearth prayers in a moment, what the background to that is. But this book is the book that formed informed the process of collecting Irish folklore by the Irish Folklore Commission, and the material that is now held in the National Folklore Collection at University College Dublin. The book, next please. The book talks about all sorts of things, of course, and including religious tradition. And religious tradition in Ireland is very copious in the folklore of Ireland, folklore legends and prayers, and much else beside. But in chapter 12 of the Handbook of Irish Folklore, which is entitled Religious Traditions, we have an enormous amount of material that is based to some extent on the Uppsala archive, which was the matrix for the Handbook of Irish Folklore. Of course, the great Protestant nation of the North, Sweden, ran a poor second to Catholic Ireland, as you might say, in terms of the richness of its contemporary religious tradition. But the Swedish and indeed the wider Nordic record is not entirely blank in that regard. And there are reflections of and parallels to many of the traditions associated with Brigit and her festival that can be traced there. And these include principally hearth prayers, which is the main theme of this presentation. Here you see on the slide a number of expressions: raking the fire, as it was sometimes called, kugilsnitinu. In other words, kugils means saving or gathering, and there was a process of gathering. First of all, disassembling the fire, separating out the glowing coals, reassembling the glowing coals and covering them with ashes. That really was what raking the fire was about. And in Scotland, it was called smallach, or in Scots, smooring. And this meant snuffing, or the act of resting, as it was also called, a peat fire. Now, in these prayers, as I say, we can find some common ground between the Gaelic tradition of Ireland and Scotland on the one hand, and the Nordic countries in these formulaic messages contained in the wordings of the folk prayers and sayings and other actions, such as those associated with Brigit and her festival. These folk prayers and accompanying actions are generally simple in form, but they are suffused with meaning. A case in point would be the time-honoured injunction for households to bid Brigit welcome on her night, on the eve of the feast. The formal welcoming of Brigit as a guest at a special family occasion was an annual event. It happened once a year. It was repeated from house to house on the eve of her feast day. The wording attached to the intriguing doorstep ceremony goes as follows in translation: "Go on your knees, open your eyes, and let Brigit in." This drew the enthusiastic response from those within: "Welcome, welcome, welcome to the noble woman." You see in the next slide, next please. you see the wording in Irish of the prayer that is said on that occasion, on that occasion, and indeed on every occasion, every time the fire was raked, on other nights of the year too. These things have a venerable ring to them, and I think I would like to emphasize that there are not the idiosyncratic fancy or invention of one individual, but a community patrimony handed down for generations, and luckily for us, captured for posterity by foresighted intervention. Now, the domestic occasion is also ageless in scope, as just as the welcome for Brigit was, and it differs from the admission ceremony in that that involved participants both within and without the walls of the home. It differs in that it was carried on a nightly rather than an annual basis, and it also differs in that it was not the entire family that was involved, but a solo performance on the hearth side by the woman of the house. Now, she would deliver the hearthside prayer for raking the ashes, and she would cover the ashes in the manner prescribed and recite this prayer, probably last thing at night, probably when everybody else was abed, and she might have been, but that was the chore that she performed, and it was her designated task. Next, please. Here you see a sample of the Scottish Gaelic smooring or raking the fire blessing. I'll save a little time by leaving you to look at it yourself. You see the Gaelic on top and the English translation by Alexander Carmichael, who collected the material underneath. Carmichael said of the smooring exercise, he said that the ceremony is artistic and symbolic and is performed with loving care. Now, both these prayers address in Ireland and in Scotland, and there's another version coming up next. You can show you another Scottish version, Scottish Gaelic version. Of the same elaborate. They're very elaborate by comparison with the Irish ones, and I haven't time to talk about why that might be just now, but you can see that for yourselves. But they address the same challenge. The fire is saved, and you have Brigit and Mary in tandem being involved in encircling it. As it says in Irish, Brig in a bun, agus muide in a bar. Brig beneath it, and Mary on top, along with the 12 angels of the graces, as the Irish prayer said. Here you have the twin concerns of maintaining and containing the fire, and all embodied in the wording of this prayer. This version, by the way, that I quoted in Irish, I collected myself from Molly Henry of Kilgalligan in Erris in County Mayo, and I'm happy to say that Molly's granddaughter, or one of her granddaughters, is participating in this program here this evening as a viewer. Now, I'll pass over the Scottish Gaelic versions and go to the next slide, if I may, please. The one following that, next, please. And I'll move to Scandinavia. And here in front of you, you see a Swedish hearth prayer. It says, Jag fäster denne ild I glö så viss som Jungfru Maria var mö. I fix this fire aglow as sure as the Virgin Mary was a maid. Here you have, in Scandinavia, you have the same pattern of a nightly prayer and an annual ceremonial. So it's a mirror image of what happens or happened in Ireland and Scotland. The encompassment of the fire in the embrace of two powerful female figures is absent here, as you will note. Only one such is represented in this prayer, is Swedish prayer. But another more elaborate Nordic version does include, next please, does include mention of a Scandinavian male saint. Next slide, please. Called Saint Knut. And this is either a Swedish dialect version or a Norwegian version. I can't say which. Tonight I shall rake the fire. Tomorrow I shall receive it alive. Help me, God and Saint Knut, that my heat never dies. This Santa Knut is mentioned here. He was in fact a real person. He was a Danish nobleman who was called Knut Lavard, who was murdered treacherously and canonized in the year 1169, and to the present day St. Knut's Day, either on the 7th or the 13th of January. It varies from place to place, but it coincides basically with his Saint's Day, coincides with the end of the Christmas season. Next slide, please. Oh, I thought there were more slides than that. No? Can you go back, please? Yes, stop there, please. Yes, this, so could you go back just one before that, please? No, there must be some, anyway, no, forward, please. Yes, stay here, please, for the moment. Here you see another hearth prayer. This is in Norwegian, so høyt min eld skal se, og ikke høyere og heitere hel. Thus high my fire, and neither higher nor hotter. This was said on the occasion of what was known as Eldborg's skål. This was a fireside toast, and this was the prayer that was uttered on that occasion. And this Eldborg, that's spelled E-L-D-B-O-R-G. I thought I had a slide with that, but it's gone AWOL for the moment. This Eldborg is an interesting character because there was quite an elaborate ceremony associated with drinking the toast to Eldborg, as you'll know here. The day after the 13th day, that's in January, called Eldborg's Day, you drank the Eldborg's toast. The woman of the house came in with a bowl of ale, stood by the hearth, and drank the health of the fire. She then sprinkled a little in the fire with these words you see on the screen. So høyt min eld og ikke høyere og heitere hel. Thus high my fire, and neither higher nor hotter. Afterwards you drank like this. You sat on the floor with this bowl of ale between your legs and your hands behind your back. You lifted the bowl with your mouth, drank up the ale, and with a flick of your head cast it behind you. If the bowl landed upside down, you would die within the year. If not, then you would be lucky enough to drink Eldborg's skål the following year once again. Another account tells us that a person would stand in front of the fire and drink the toast and take a little of the ale in a spoon and sprinkle it over the pile of embers and pray that the house and property would not take fire. When everyone had a drink, the old woman of the house or some other person took a spoonful of ale or maybe spirits and put it on the fire and let it burn up. At bedtime, you raked the ashes nicely together and recited in a low voice the prayer that I quoted earlier. Tonight I shall rake the fire. Tomorrow I will receive it alive. Help me, God and Santa Knut, that my heat never dies out. So this rather short comparison of Gaelic and Norse prayers and ceremonial has revealed, I believe, some interesting parallels, and it has exposed some apparent divergences. The most glaring of these relates to the encompassment of the fire explicitly by two powerful female figures in Gaelic tradition, and this does not seem to be matched in the far north. But fire maintenance and containment in Scandinavian prayers, on the other hand, do mention supplication to, among others, God, the Virgin Mary, Saint Knut, and this shadowy figure of Saint Elborg. Saint Elborg, in fact, was not a saint at all, but it was simply a name applied by the people, as well as paralleling with Santa Knut. Elborg simply means, has two elements, eld, meaning fire, and borg, which derives from a verb meaning to save or preserve. So fire protector is the name of someone who was able to achieve the protection, maintaining and containing the fire. And Elborg was used in Norway in modern times, right down to modern times, as a female name, as a name for a woman. And it was perceived, obviously, Elborg, this mysterious figure, Elborg, was perceived as being female. So perhaps I might end on a note of speculation and say that perhaps we have in the person of Elborg, not the fire protector, but the fire protectress, just like Brigit. And in that sense, perhaps, and this is a bit of a jump, I fully realize we can match the two powerful female figures of Brigit and Mary saving the fire in Ireland and in Scotland with Elborg and the Virgin Mary. I would also say that the reverence and the obeisance that was paid in Scandinavian folk tradition in the way that people saved the fire on and prayed to this Saint Elborg is matched by the welcome, it seems to me, that was accorded on this side of the North Sea to our own holy and noble woman, Brigit. So this brings my remarks on this occasion on Irish, Scottish and Scandinavian hearth and fire care protocols and associated seasonal celebrations to a close, and to coin a phrase, thus far my speech, but no farther. Thank you.
A wonderful presentation from Séamas, and we have several questions, but I'll let Séamas have a moment to catch his breath after that wonderful presentation. And I suppose firstly I just want to say I hoped my pronunciation was correct, but I did get Evelie's pronunciation slightly wrong, so apologies for that. So instead of Evelie, as I mispronounced it, Evelie Delfino Sales Poshk. So thank you, Evelie, for pointing that out. We had a few questions for, let me see now. We had actually we've had a few questions that have been answered in the chat. If anybody wants more clarification, let me know. One of them was around the pronunciation of the Chris. So I hope that's sorted out. But again, if you have any questions that you feel haven't been answered, you can ask them again. Let me see now. We had one for Mary there from a lady called Connie. Is it known who Brigit's foster mother was? I suppose this is either to Séamas or Mary. So I'll throw it out there.
So I didn't quite catch the question, Natalie.
No problem. Is it known who Brigit's foster mother was?
Brigit is known in folk tradition herself as the foster mother to Christ.
Perfect. That's great. So I hope that answered your question. Oh, yeah.
Natalie, I can maybe address that question.
Yep.
When Brigit was in Connemara, she and her something happened when she woke up one morning and said, "This will be mine, this will be mine," and the people of Connemara threw her out. But they said that the druid could stay there. But anyway, the druid eventually sent her out to be fostered by a foster mother. But there was no, they were never given a name. The foster mother was never given a name, but her biological mother, my camera is off. I thought I turned it on. Her biological mother was called Brishak, and the word Brishak actually means badger. And what's really interesting is that the badger and the skin of the badger is also related to the Cailleach at Slieve Gullion. And I'm looking at the Irish tradition, and it looks as though both Connemara and the badger and Brishak belong to the Cailleach tradition. But I'm still kind of exploring that at the moment. But there's no account given of the foster mother except that she was a Christian, because during the night when Brigit was in Connemara, the bishops came in a dream during the night and re-baptized her, because she'd been originally baptized in milk. And so they had to, the bishops had to come and baptize her as a Christian. So that's why she had to go to the foster mother. Also because she kept getting sick, because she could only drink from the milk of the pure milk of the white red-eared cow, which again, in the ancient tradition, the white red-eared cow is a symbol of the other world. So Brigit was bridging, the other world and this world. But the foster mother was never named, except that later on, when Brigit went to another place, her foster mother became ill, and Brigit went and she healed her, and then she also healed her mother. And one of the stories that I didn't have time to speak of today was also in relation to her mother, because Brigit had taken the goods of the druid and his wife, and they were absolutely furious, and they wanted to kill Brigit as well. But Brigit then produced everything that they had otherwise been robbed of, and they had enough for the party and enough for the feast, and they were so grateful that they said to Brigit, "Well, you can have all the cows, you can have all the milk, you can have all the butter." And Brigit turned around and she said, "I want none of that. All I want is my mother's freedom." And I think that's an extraordinary story to be in the lives of St. Brigit. All I want is my mother's freedom, because she's speaking there about intergenerational trauma and the need for healing. And I think that's a very valuable, epithet, little incident for feminism today, because of the kind of sometimes the hostility there is between the generations. So sorry to be long-winded, but we don't know who her foster mother was because she was never given a name. That's typical of many women. What can we say?
Great answer, Mary. And I hope, Connie, that was comprehensive for you. Then we have an interesting question here from Alistair McIntosh. He says, "Thank you, Professor Ó Catháin, for your deep work. It is lovely to see the Scottish tradition in a Gaelic continuum with the Irish, united and not divided by the Irish Sea, celebrated in a way that you are doing. However, since around the early 1990s, there has been a put down amongst some UK scholars on Celtic ethnology. Some of the so-called Celto-skeptics dismiss the spirituality of the tradition, its woman-centeredness, and its closeness to nature. My question is this: where do you stand in relation to these criticisms that, in my view at least, miss the point of what you so beautifully named as the patrimony of the community?" Or any of our panelists, if they have thoughts on this kind of Celto-skepticism. Séamas, I think you're on mute.
Okay. I think it's entirely misplaced, as I would hope, what I had to say about the common ground between the Gaelic traditions of Ireland and Scotland on the one hand, and those of Scandinavia. And I made passing reference with a smile to the great Protestant nation of the North, Sweden, in other words, that preserved, long after the Reformation, preserved these old Catholic prayers long enough for them to be collected in the 18th and 19th centuries in Sweden. And of course, similarly so in Norway. So, I mean, I think if it'll come as a surprise, I think, probably to some people in the Nordic world, that there is another similar but even richer tradition on this side of the North Sea in Ireland and Scotland. And I would say you ignore that at your peril.
Thank you, Séamas. Does anybody have anything to add from the panel?
I think maybe, Natalie, that skepticism might actually come down to worldview, that we could argue that the Celtic view, if we want to call it that, is an indigenous worldview. And there are 4 characteristics to that, one of which is a very, very close connection with nature, with the environment, because they're very much aware that they are just part of the environment. The other thing is the storytelling. If they always have an origin story, the legends and myths are very important to them, gives them identity. The third one is it's an oral pedagogy. And finally, what they actually have is an incredibly close connection with the spirit world. There is actually no gap. It is seamless. And so I think if you try to say that these, if you want to get rid of this whole Celtic thing, or we won't even call it Celtic, this oral tradition, you're looking at it from a rationalist, from a Cartesian mentality, and the two just don't meet. So I think you actually have to go back and ask them, from what perspective are you actually looking at this? Are you looking at it from the native person, the indigenous person, or are you actually looking at it from your perspective as a scientist or whatever?
Very interesting. No, really, really interesting contribution, Rosarie. Really, really thought-provoking. The next question is from Eileen Durkin, and she asks, can you share if there are any traditions associated with St. Brigit as an educator? So I'll open that to the panel, whoever would like to answer.
Teaching by example, perhaps?
Yeah. I think this is back to the oral pedagogy. It's not written down. You know, a farmer, even today, somebody training horses, it's not written in a book. I saw the best example recently of our farrier showing a young fellow next door how to hold a horse's leg, to lift it, to put on a shoe, or to just trim it. Actually, it was just trimming it. It wasn't to put on a shoe. And it was a masterpiece of teaching. It's the only way I could describe it. It was, I wish I had recorded it. The patience, the way he showed him exactly where to pick up, what to touch on the leg so that the horse would automatically lift the leg, everything in about 10 minutes. No way could you write it in a book. And my own experience with vernacular healers, it was exactly the same. I remember asking a healer, he was giving out about surgeons having to do a biopsy. And he said, I can't understand it that they don't recognize skin cancer the minute they see it. And I was kind of looking at this man and I said, well, let's put it like this. I said, what age were you when you started training with your uncle? Oh, he said, I was old enough. He said, I was 5. He was now 55. I mean, no surgeon had that level of training. He could see cancer a mile away because it was intuitive. So I think what Séamas is saying is correct. It was example.
I think that's a really good point. And Mary might have one as well. I think, is there a story about maybe in the older myths about Bridget being a daughter of the Dagda and the three Bridgets, maybe?
Can I relate that to another question that's on the thing? Because the Dagda Séamas may disagree with this, but I think the Dagda is a literary creation for the saga literatures, because the real figure who gave his place names to Ireland was the Badach, and the Badach is translated as penis, but actually the place names all over Ireland are called after him. There's nothing called after the Dagda. So I don't think Bridget was the daughter of the Dagda, and I think the Scottish tradition holds the memories much more closely, because at Bealtaine, which is the 1st of May, they have a tradition in Glenlyon in Perthshire where they have the Cailleach and the Badach and the daughter, and they're taken out of the shieling that they live in during the winter to look over the harvest. And then at Samhain, the Badach and the Cailleach and the daughter, who is Brigit, because in some parts of Scotland, they held that the year was divided into two, where, because winter arrives much, or spring arrives much later in Scotland than it does in Ireland, and certainly in the north. And so Bride, the young daughter is taken out at Bealtaine. So I think the Dagda is a literary creation. And when you say that Bridget was the daughter of the Dagda, it's only to put her into some saga literature where she's effectively subjugated, because in one famous literature, it's called the Second Battle of Mytura, the Dagda is ridiculed. So even though he's in there, he's treated, pretty badly, as Bridget is also, because her son is a betrayer and her husband is something else. And, anyway, so there's a lot in what I'm saying is in the literary tradition, and this is where I totally agree with both Séamas and Rosary, we have to go back to the vernacular. We have to go back to the living traditions to learn what is true of the indigenous Ireland, because the saga literature is, I hate to say this, it's mostly subjugation literature. Even the stories about the Tuhadé, they end up very badly for the Tuhadé, because they're eventually put under the ground, as the Furies are in Greece and other countries. They become the unconscious of the social order. And it's time, that we resurrected the unconscious and began to think about it much more deeply, and not pay as much attention to the written literature, although it too can tell us a great deal, but we have to look at it very, with great suspicion, and with bluntly gender lenses, because the main subjugation is keeping women down. That's to be blunt.
Amazing points there, Mary. We're going to have to, unfortunately, I'd probably like one more question, but I think really good points there about how we really have to think critically and how difficult it is to have that critical lens as well without, I suppose, being immersed in it. So amazing points. We have two questions here that kind of relate to each other, really talking about the connection between Bridget and the Cailleach. So that's one. And then the second one is about the fire that doesn't burn being the heat of the Kundalini energy, possibly, and the heat and power surges women experience during the journey into menopause and also pregnancy. I don't know if somebody can maybe throw shed a bit of light on those 2 points, Bridget and the Cailleach, and then this Kundalini fire energy. Anything else we might just have to put up on a Facebook post or send out later.
I can talk a little bit about if Séamas or Rose don't want to say some, or the Kundalini energy and the Nearth are very, very similar. And again, we go back to Scotland, because in Scotland on the 1st of February, there's a story told by Alexander Carmichael where the woman of the house took a sock and put some embers from the fire into it and went out and knocked on the ground to wake up, wake up, wake up. And some traditions say she was waking the serpent. And of course, the serpent is the image of the DNA. And different cultures will wake up the Kundalini. Some call it Kundalini energy, some call it Shakti, some call it the Nearth. But they're similarly, each of them are saying, wake up, the time has come. And I know that Séamas in his brilliant writings also refers to the bear and we'll have to wait until his next his revised issue of the Festival of Brigit comes out. In relation to the Cailleach, the Cailleach is the one who either created or shaped the landscape of Ireland with her cloak. And so I would see Brigit as being the daughter of the Cailleach, and the Cailleach daughters are all over Ireland and under different names, like the Ingham Bui, like Losser, like Godnet, like Blanet, like Manana. There are many different names for the Cailleach all over Ireland. So that's the kind of work that we need to do to recuperate those traditions.
Yeah, we are running a little.
Have I time to say a word?
I'll go for it.
Yeah, I just want. Mary's absolutely right about these things, and she knows a great deal more about them than anybody else, it seems to me. But I just wanted to say that it's very useful, indeed necessary, to consider what the literary tradition says about Brigit, alongside and against the contemporary oral tradition. One informant from Donegal, in describing the doorstep ceremony that I spoke of earlier, and other things, the Brat Brigit and the Chris Brigit and so on and so forth, just said at the end of his discourse, he said, of course, he said, there was a Brigit up in Kildare, but this is Brigit from her place.
Well, that was really fantastic Q&A there. I'm so sorry that we're going to have to stop at that. We're running a little bit over, but we still have a few bits to go. We're going to see a beautiful short film on the season of Imbolug and Brigit by Grace Wells. Grace is an award-winning eco-poet and environmental writer. Her third book of poetry, The Church of Love and the World, is due out from Daedalus Press in Dublin in this May. So I will hand you over for this film, and then we're going to have a thank you by Joy Powell, and then some final music by Pádraig Ní Dhúlahan's Banu Blessings.
Imbolc. Vision. In the cold of late January, me Anna. In the first fresh days of February, me Fiara. The Cailleach lets go her hold. Fragile days, slight as the sickle moon. The first slithers of light brightening the horizon to announce the maiden goddess's return. Brigit carried back to us over the wildest seas, on the highest tides, and in their lowest ebb. Brigit come to lay out the dying winter, to birth the spring between her hands, her hips, and at her hips she wears a belt of stars. The Chris midwife's buckle all across the world, the three sisters, the Tres Marias, the belt of stars that births us into wonder. Her new season, fragile as an infant, born into sleet and hail. Spring, tenuous as the glimmers of light returning, each day 2 minutes more. Brigit's strength swelling by the smallest increment. Calling the sap to rise, the ferns to uncurl. Cycles of frost and sun burning the new leaves. And Brigit, goddess of healing, repairing each bud. Until the Cailleach's cloak becomes Brigit's mantle. a dew of mercy falling equally on all things. Brigit, patron of the animals, waking the bees to wing, rousing the birds to nest, calling the hare to dance. Goddess of weaving, rethreading the weft of life, each bud, each leaf, a fleck in the body of the goddess, a filament of the divine. Brigit, come to our threshold to ask, how have you overwintered? Goddess of creativity, asking after the poetry in your life. Goddess of smithcraft, silver, gold and iron, beauty and practicality, tool and implement, asking, how do you tend to the world? Inviting us into her alchemy, into the oldest love affair of all, the long marriage between culture and nature, over, under, through, a binding of tendril and verse, filigree and frond, leaf and song. All that is tangled shall be unravelled, all that is frayed can be mended. And people and place being one, the children here take rushes from the fields to weave the body of the goddess, shaping the limbs of her 4 directions, over, under, through, binding at the center the 5th province of faith. With its soft eye that sees the sacred in her every thread. Brigit, goddess of the spring, who tides us over till her blossoms come.
And so, after that final beautiful film by Grace Wells, again, I began by blessing you, Banu, agus Kate Mila Falcha, 100,000 welcomes. I now want to say Mila Buikas, so that's miles and miles and millions of blessings, millions and millions of thanks, sorry. So I want to say thank you especially to our presenters, to Jenny and Rosari, to Ruth and Mary and Séamas, and to our wonderful musicians and singers, Pádraig Ní and Evelyn. The hair stood on the back of my neck too, and I know people in the chat said the same. So I hope our gathering has offered you some nourishment, that like myself, you felt something of that Nearth divine energy, that will, I hope, be the fire that that burns, that gives life to your own creativity as we approach the springtime and the Brigit's Feast on the 1st of February. So Ihawa from Dublin, from Joy here in Dublin. There's a final blessing, I think, Natalie. We probably just go into that. It's a beautiful piece by Pádraig. Thank you, everybody.
Goman in yellow.